It's my great pleasure to welcome you to USC and also to express my delight that you're here for this lecture this evening. Last year, the Price School and the Fred W. Smith National Library partnered to launch the George Washington Leadership Lecture Series. These events explore President Washington's lifelong accomplishments, really providing a better understanding of him as a person, as well as his remarkable leadership, his professional achievements, and his amazing lasting legacy. This collaboration was made possible by generous support of Maribeth and William Borthwick. And Maribeth is a distinguished USC alumna and serves as the Vice Regent for California of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which we love that connection. And both William and Maribeth are here. Would you please rise and let us thank you for your generous support. So we're very excited to extend the series into its second year, building upon the strong momentum of last year. And we envision these events as being bi-coastal, as really connecting the West Coast and USC to Mount Vernon and the library. So last October, we had the honor of convening at Mount Vernon. And today, we are very excited to bring the conversation to somewhat warm Southern California. Some of you may not be that familiar with the USC Price School and what we do, and I just wanted to take a moment to explain who we are. Our mission is to improve the quality of life for people and their communities, and we accomplish this mission through research and education that is focused on solving the most pressing policy issues facing the nation, as well as planning and developing better communities for the future. We were established about 85 years ago in 1928-29, which makes us one of the oldest public policy schools in the country. And currently we're ranked number 6 nationally by U.S. News and World Report. One of the things that underscores all of the work we do is a commitment to public service. And George Washington once wrote that, quote, "Human happiness and moral duty are inseparably connected." So our school really embraces these words. As we strive to make a positive impact in our communities and on society, we are guided by a strong sense of ethics and core values, and we seek to instill these values in our students. USC Price is an interdisciplinary school with academic programs in the fields of public administration, nonprofit leadership, health policy and management, public policy and urban planning, and real estate development. And interestingly, in a variety of ways, George Washington, his work aligns closely with this interdisciplinary mix in our school. He contributed to shaping the fields, really, in which our faculty conduct research and our students pursue their careers. As you know, he was a government leader. He was also a famous military commander. What you may not know is that he was also a surveyor and city planner who helped plan Washington, D.C. In addition, he was a real estate developer in the western state of Ohio, and he was also a health innovator in disease prevention, wound care, and nutrition at Valley Forge. So he covers the breadth of what we do in our school in a remarkable way. So together with the Fred W. Smith National Library, we look forward to advancing the study of George Washington and promoting the values that he stood for, including the topic of tonight's lecture, which is citizenship and civic engagement, which we'll discuss in a moment. And this, as you know, is a hugely important topic for our society and for our country. The importance of education and understanding our government and the civics in our society. And so I'm really excited about learning about the origins of that with George Washington. And this evening we have the privilege of learning about this major role for education in shaping our knowledge and understanding of a citizen civic responsibilities. And leading our talk are two noted experts. The U.S. Undersecretary of Education, Ted Mitchell, we're really pleased that you're here, Ted, and Denver Brunsman, Associate Professor of History at George Washington University, who studies the politics and social history of the American Revolution era. And Ted, Denver, we're also very pleased that you are here. Doug Bradburn, the founding director of the Fred W. Smith National Library, was originally scheduled to be one of our featured speakers, but unfortunately his father passed away, and he's unable to join us tonight. So we send our deepest condolences to Doug and his family. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our moderator, USC professor, Price Professor, Dr. David Sloane. David is a leading expert and prominent scholar in American urban history, urban planning, community urban planning, and public policy. He's also the former director of our urban planning graduate programs and recently directed our undergraduate program, which is the largest program in our school. And under his leadership, he led a process that greatly revised and improved our curriculum that helped prepare our students to graduate study or to professional careers. So, in addition, David is the primary liaison between our school and the George Washington Library at Mount Vernon, which is an ideal role given his expertise and background. So please join me in welcoming David Sloane.
I first want to echo Jack's comments and thank the Borthwicks for their foresight to endow this series, which we hope will become a symbol not just of Washington's continuing relevance to contemporary society, but also his key place, his critical place in our nation's history. Tonight, two deeply knowledgeable historians are going to take us on a fast trip through American history, focusing on issues critical to the founding generation and to us today. What is citizenship? How do we understand the concept? How do we educate ourselves and those who will follow us about that concept, about how to be good citizens? Not surprisingly, these questions are not simply answered, and the debates about them span the centuries to our contemporary political divides. From the efforts of President Washington to create a national university, to our current debates about the appropriateness of educating undocumented immigrants, the rights of citizenship and the meaning of citizenship long have stoked debate and discussion, and we hope that will continue tonight. The way it's going to work is our first speaker, who, as Jack pointed out, kindly stepped in as a last-minute replacement for Doug, to whom I also send my condolences and sympathies. Denver Brunsman will tell us a story about the early concepts of citizenship during the the Revolutionary era and the early national period. Ted Mitchell will then follow Doug's analysis of the Revolutionary era by taking us for really what is a pretty quick and fast tour of the rest of American history through Reconstruction and Progressive era controversies, and finishing with a brief consideration of our contemporary educational debates. After we have the two relatively short, they're going to be somewhere around 15, 20 minutes, we're going to have a panel session with the two speakers, which I'll ask a few questions, and then I will open it up to you. So please be prepared with your questions. So let's go. Let me ask you to welcome Professor Brunsman to USC. He is an associate professor of history at George Washington University, writing on the politics and social history of the American Revolution. His 2013 book, The Evil Necessity, which I had forgotten. I wrote a book called The Great Last Necessity. The Evil Necessity, British Naval Impressment in the 18th Century Atlantic World, received the Walter Cohen Memorial Prize for outstanding work in 18th century studies in the Americas and the Atlantic world. His other honors include research fellowships from the National Endowment for Humanities, the McNeil Center for the Early American Studies, and the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. Intriguingly, and in the question and answer, you could ask him about this if you wish, he also teaches a George Washington University class at Mount Vernon on George Washington and his world. Please join me with a warm welcome for Professor Brunsman.
Well, thank you, David, for that kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here, to be part of this marvelous collaboration between the Price School of Public Policy and the Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington. And I also want to reinforce the gratitude that all of us feel, Maribeth Borthwick, for all of your support for this program. It's really appreciated and important. Yes, again. Before starting, I also wanted to recognize my good friend, Doug Bradburn. Doug is the nation's, really the world's preeminent expert on early American citizenship, and he has great affection for this program. And the topic has Doug's fingerprints all over it, combining the topics of education and citizenship. And it's perfect for George Washington because he thought about them together frequently. So what I want to do tonight is I want to begin with citizenship. I want to talk about early American citizenship and describe the amazing transformation that the American people went through during the Revolutionary era, when they went from being dependent subjects of a monarch to citizens, free citizens of a republic. I next want to shift to Washington and his views on education and how he saw education as being critical to fostering good citizenship. And as in so many areas, Washington's views on civics couldn't be more relevant to our world today. So I'll start with fireworks. Everyone loves fireworks, right along with kittens, right? And as is evident in this scene, Washington, D.C., my much maligned home, we love America. We do. And I think that's true across America. I don't think there's a problem today with a lack of patriotism. I think if there's a problem, it might be with a lack of focus sometimes with our patriotism. And in particular, we miss the radical implications of the country that was founded in 1776, particularly as it relates to citizenship. In creating the United States, Washington and the other founders had a choice to form any style of government. They could have created another monarchy or a dictatorship of some sort, but instead they chose to make the United States a republic. And I think this sense of America as a republic is something that's lost today. In the 18th century, a republic had a set of very specific meanings. First of all, it was a representative form of government, the opposite of a monarchy. It was also based on the principle of social equality. That is, no members of a republic could have a title. There was no earls, dukes, viscounts, and certainly no kings and queens in a republic. Instead, all the members of the republic were citizens, equal in rank. And last, there was a moral dimension to being a citizen in a republic. And it's reflected in the Latin root of the word, res publica, the public thing. Members of a republic had to be committed to the common good, to the public good over their own self-interest. And so for those of you that are versed in the life of George Washington, all this will sound very familiar because his life and career really followed the definition of republicanism, almost like a script. He had so many important roles in the founding of the country: Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, the first president, the symbolic father, the indispensable man. I want to add one more to that list, and that is citizen-in-chief. Washington cemented his status as America's citizen-in-chief in a single dramatic act, resigning his commission and surrendering his power as commander of American forces at the end of the Revolutionary War. It's captured in this famous painting by John Trumbull, which hangs in the Capitol Rotunda. On December 23, 1783, Washington addressed Congress, which was meeting at Annapolis, Maryland at the time. And he said, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all employments of public life." There was no better way for Washington to show that he identified himself as an equal with his countrymen than to return to private life as a citizen at Mount Vernon after winning the war. As we know from countless subsequent revolutions in world history, this is always the hard part. It's not that difficult to rebel against authority. The difficult part is once you get in charge and to have the integrity to give up power. Washington's actions stunned the Atlantic world. Trumbull, who would paint this generation later, was in London at the time, and when he heard the reports of what Washington had done, he wrote back and said that this excites the astonishment and admiration of this part of the world. 'Tis a conduct so novel, so inconceivable to people who, far from giving up powers they possess, are willing to convulse the empire to acquire more. It was enough to impress another George, King George III, who predicted that if Washington had truly retired from public life and returned to his farm, then he will be the greatest man in the world. And Washington's integrity really was key to his leadership. We have to wonder, why was he continually chosen for all these important jobs? Why was he chosen to be commander-in-chief of the Army? Why was he president of the Constitutional Convention? Why was he chosen to be the first president of the United States? And the simple answer is that the American people trusted him. They knew that underneath all of his greatness, he identified himself as a citizen along with them, a member of a society of equals. So in teaching about Washington to college students, one of the greatest challenges, probably the greatest challenge, is humanizing him. He always seems so perfect. He always makes the right decision that it can actually be somewhat demoralizing to try to emulate somebody who does everything right all the time. And so my answer to that is to stress to the students that Washington made himself into the person that he became, the leader that he became. He wasn't born as a citizen with perfect Republican virtues. Of course, he was born as a subject of the British Crown in a society defined by inequities and inherited titles and power. This portrait, done by Charles Wilson Peale in 1772, is the earliest depiction that we have of Washington. And it shows him in his role as colonel of the Virginia Regiment during the French and Indian War in the 1750s. This is the closest that you'll ever see Washington as a redcoat. But of course, his red jacket is for the Virginia militia, which was still a British force at the time. He had last worn this uniform 15 years before. So I kind of think about it like the guy that goes into the attic and puts on his wedding tux, and he's, it's a little bit tight around the middle. Washington was very proud of his militia service. And for all he knew, this would be the last portrait that was ever done of him. And so this is how he wanted to be remembered at the time. But the uniform was also a painful reminder of Washington's rejection in his bid to get a commission in the British Army, a decision that was largely based on his American birth. His frustration played a key role in his decision to resign his commission from the Virginia Regiment, go back to public life, and this happened in 1758, same year he was first elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. And Washington might not have realized it at the time, but I think he was feeling frustrations with the entire British social and political system, a system that didn't reward merit, but rested on a very strict social hierarchy that was based on birth. At the top of the system was King George III. This is one of my favorite examples of monarchical splendor and excess. And I'd like to say that no animals were harmed in the making of this portrait, but I'm afraid that they were. This was a generation before Thomas Paine's Common Sense would expose the absurdity of monarchy and hereditary titles in the Age of Reason, when George ascended the throne. Before that time, before Paine, and before the American Revolution, colonists like Washington automatically assumed that they were born subjects of the crown. A subject was by definition inferior. Their lives were at the disposal of the monarch. Being a subject was a life sentence. The common law doctrine of indefeasible or perpetual allegiance basically meant once a king's subject, always a king's subject. It was impossible to leave the realm once born into it. The American Revolution changed these rules. They changed the rules that govern the relationship between individuals and the state. And instead of the medieval notion of perpetual allegiance to a monarch, there was the idea of volitional or voluntary allegiance to a country of one's choice. citizens shared a consensual relationship with the state that was defined in terms of rights, not authority. If subjecthood was an obligation, citizenship was a choice. As Americans, we often take all this for granted, our citizenship and its origins. But it was a huge leap for the founding generation to make. And the difficulty of the transition is evident in a story that came out of the Library of Congress a couple of years ago, and you may remember this. The Declaration of Independence refers to the American people as our fellow citizens. But it was discovered that in one of Jefferson's original drafts of the Declaration, that he had mistakenly wrote subjects instead of citizens. And the slide here shows how preservation scientists at the library use electronic imaging to discover Jefferson's mistake and really his cover-up. And he did, I think, what any of us would do in this situation. He used everything he could. He had an eraser. The technology hasn't changed that much in 200 years. He erased. He wrote over the word subjects, made it into citizens, and he probably thought that he got away with it. And he might have, were it not for our 21st century technology. And I use this story to try to lure students to become history majors. I say it's just like CSI. I mean, it's very glamorous. Well, this episode shows that even a committed revolutionary like Jefferson was so ingrained to think like a subject that he had to remind himself that America was now the land of citizens. The notion of American citizenship, much like the United States, was an invention, a glorious invention, but an invention nonetheless. The founders soon discovered that while far preferable to subjecthood, citizenship had its own problems. One of the challenges I think continues to vex us today and is the reason for us gathering here and for this great collaboration. And that is that it requires active, educated, vigilant citizens to make a republic really work. Whereas monarchies benefited from complacency. If a king or queen ever needed something, they could compel the subjects to do it. Republics depend on educated citizens and a spirit of active engagement in public affairs. The problem is neatly captured in a famous story from the Constitutional Convention. This is an image of the chair that George Washington sat in for nearly 3 months as the president of the convention in Philadelphia in 1787. At the end of the proceedings, Benjamin Franklin remarked, "I have often looked at that sun behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now I know that it is a rising sun." When Franklin left Independence Hall, he was asked by a woman, "Well, doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" And he famously replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." Those are very haunting words, if you can keep it. And keeping a republic requires active citizens, a proposition that I think we might be testing right now. Well, for George Washington, education was especially crucial to the survival of America's Republican experiment. He was too modest to frame it this way, but the basic problem was that not everyone could be a George Washington. Not everyone had impeccable character and perfect Republican instincts. And so the solution was civics education, training in the principles of Republican government and virtuous citizenship. Of course, Washington was not alone in connecting education to the fortunes of the American Republic. An important idea to come out of the American Revolution was the concept of Republican motherhood. And this was the idea that mothers needed to educate their sons to be good citizens, and they had to keep their husbands in line. Dual responsibility. Washington didn't dispute this. He didn't dispute the value of education in the home, but he wanted to expand access to formal education for all Americans. Washington's efforts began with his own family. Education was a very personal issue for him because when he was 11 years old, his father died, and this really ended any chance that he had of getting a college education. He never went overseas, as did his older half-brothers. And so for the rest of his life, Washington's lack of a formal education, what he called my defective education, was one of his greatest insecurities. Although it must be said that he was a first-rate autodidact, much like Abraham Lincoln, and really made himself into an Enlightenment figure. Still, he wanted to make sure that his stepchildren, through his marriage to Martha, and his step-grandchildren, who are in this painting, didn't have to face the same disadvantages that he did. So he sent his stepson, John Parke Custis, known as Jackie, to King's College in New York City, which is today Columbia. Well, the more normal route for an aspiring Virginia gentleman would have been to go to William and Mary. But Washington wanted Jackie to shed his local prejudices, and he wanted him to embrace the emerging American Union. Washington did the same for Jackie's son, George Washington Parke Custis, known as Wash, the boy in this painting. His other nickname was Tub. I don't know if they put them together. Washington sent Wash to the College of New Jersey, today Princeton. Well, neither of the Custis boys turned out to be great scholars. The Custis women were always much more accomplished in music and the arts. But Washington never gave up stressing the value of education. As he wrote to Jackie, "I conceive a knowledge of books is the basis upon which other knowledge is to be built." Well, Washington did not just support the education of his stepchildren and his step-grandchildren. He supported the education of his nieces, his nephews, the children of his friends and acquaintances, even complete strangers. I think an interesting exercise would be to try to find out how many tuition bills Washington was paying at any given time. He would especially appreciate the free community college proposal from last night's State of the Union. He took a very active interest in the broader education of the American people as well. In this painting, you can see his beloved Potomac River in the background. The map in front of George and Martha is of the new federal district, what became Washington, D.C. Some people claim that Martha's fan is resting on the area that became the mall. Washington took a more active role in the planning of the district than most people realize. And from the very start, he wanted the district to include a national university, an idea that David mentioned. Washington wrote about the university on multiple occasions during his presidency. He didn't like the idea of America's youth going over to Europe to become educated. He thought they'd become corrupted by aristocratic influences. He also wanted a national university to help promote the American Union. The same reason that he had sent Jackie and Wash to northern colleges instead of to William and Mary. And so he had this idea that children would come, young people would come from all over the United States to the federal district, and they would stop being just Virginians and New Yorkers and South Carolinians, and they would begin to become Americans. In September 1796, Washington described his goals to Alexander Hamilton of promoting education generally as one of the surest means of enlightening and giving just ways of thinking to our citizens, but particularly the establishment of a university, where the youth from all parts of the United States might receive the polish of erudition in the arts, sciences, and belles letters. Most important, he believed that training America's youth in government, what we would call civics or even political science, was crucial to the success of Republican self-government. As much as possible, Washington wanted students to attend the debates of Congress. In his final annual message to Congress in December 1796, he said, "The primary object of such a national institution should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important?" Well, alas, despite his intense lobbying, Washington's hopes for a national university were never realized in his lifetime. But in 1821, Congress finally acted on Washington's vision by creating the Columbian College, which would later grow into the George Washington University, my employer. I often tell my students at GW that they're the living embodiment of Washington's dream of a national university, and they can do something that he never did. They can get a college degree, but only if they do all the reading in my classes. That comes first. In the fall of 2013, I had a very excited student who came to class, and he had come from Capitol Hill, where he had been watching a portion of Ted Cruz's marathon filibuster, the one in which he read Green Eggs and Ham. And the student came to me and he said, I did what Washington wanted. I watched Congress, and then I came to class. And I said, well, that might not be exactly what Washington had in mind, but close. You're trying. Even though Washington never saw the building of the National University, he did contribute to other schools. This is a picture of the Alexandria Academy, a school in Alexandria, Virginia, just a few miles from Mount Vernon. And beginning in 1786, there were 3 different schools that operated within the academy. On the very first floor, there was an English school that taught grammar, writing, arithmetic, physical sciences, a school that we might resemble today. On the second floor was a language school that taught classical Latin and Greek. And on the third floor, it's really the most interesting, was something called a free school. And it was the forerunner of the public school system. Well, Washington established a fund to educate orphans and the poor, including girls, at the free school. His annual contribution of 50 pounds paid for the education of 20 students each year. And like any good donor, he requested progress reports on all of the students that he funded. In his will, Washington left $4,000 on Bank of Alexandria stock, which was a lot of money at the time, for the academy. Well, the school went on to have a very interesting history. In 1812, it started housing a free school for the children of free blacks in Alexandria. Robert E. Lee attended the lower floors of the school as a youth between 1818 and 1823, and to this day, it's used for educational purposes in Alexandria. The academy wasn't the only educational beneficiary in Washington's will. Washington's will is a fascinating document. This is just the first of 29 handwritten pages. And note that as a legal document, it's to this day kept in the Fairfax County Courthouse, not in the Library of Congress or the National Archives or even at Mount Vernon. And education appears repeatedly throughout the will. Washington left funds for the Alexandria Academy, for the National University, and for something called Liberty Hall Academy, which has become Washington and Lee University. But the will is most famous for Washington's decision to free his slaves, 123 in total. He didn't have legal ownership over the remaining 195 slaves who belonged to the Custis family. In the will, he also provided funds for the slaves' education and what we might call job training. Washington's bold decision carried the implication that he believed in a multiracial future for America. Unlike many of his contemporaries, including members of his own family, he was never taken with the African colonization movement, the movement to return African Americans, to return slaves to Africa. Washington ended his life then, as he lived it, by setting the standards of citizenship in the young American Republic. As America's citizen-in-chief, he embodied the spirit of public service and self-sacrifice necessary for a fledgling republic to survive and grow. Washington viewed education, especially in the ways of government, as key to making good citizens. Denied formal schooling himself, he did everything possible to ensure that his family, his neighbors, his countrymen received a proper education. And so Mount Vernon and the Price School both honor this rich legacy with their collaboration. It's clear that we need George Washington now more than ever. Thank you.
Next, we have Ted Mitchell, who is currently serving, as you heard, as Undersecretary in the United States Department of Education. I have known Ted since our days at Dartmouth College, when he was serving as chair of the Education Department. He happened to be going on sabbatical and asked this newly minted PhD to teach his history of education class, which was the first class outside of Syracuse University I ever got to teach. Since then, he has served in a series of eminent positions, my friend, including Dean of the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA, President of Occidental College, President of the California State Board of Education, and CEO and President of the New Schools Venture Fund, an educational investment fund. But I try and remind him as often as possible, he is a great historian, and his best and his most interesting work is on civics education. Please welcome Ted.
And as many quarterbacks know, when you leave the field and you're replaced by somebody better, you never get to go back. So I think that was the last course I taught at Dartmouth as well, because I was succeeded by a far better scholar and a far better teacher and better human being too. It's really a privilege to be here, privilege to be a part of this partnership. We're privileged to share the program with Denver tonight. I also want to thank the Borthwicks for their generosity and for your vision in putting this together. I think every day I spend in Washington, I understand how important it is for us to recall the messages and the meanings that draw all of us, new generation, to public service, but hopefully help to anchor that service in the spirit of citizenship and Republican citizenship that we hope would make George Washington proud. I want to pick up where Denver left off, and as promised, I get to do the romp through American history. And I want to pick it up at this moment following the Revolution, and precisely on this point of how radical this change was to move from a system in which every person involved in the American Revolution had basically been born a British subject. And all of a sudden, relatively quickly, they needed to change. I mean, think about what that would feel like in our own lives if over a 4 to 5 year period we suddenly radically changed our form of government and David became the czar. Probably be all right for us in the end, but it would take some adjustment. And Denver was absolutely right to point out that the dominant arc of conversation among the Republican generation was how to really move away from this spirit of monarchy into one of Republican citizenship. And so Denver talked about George Washington. I think we are all fairly familiar with Thomas Jefferson's notions that an education system should be one of the ways in which America became a meritocracy. And very smart people from modest means would, through a system of general education, be brought to light into positions of great leadership. So from the beginning, this idea of tearing down the social structures that bound authoritarian regimes was central to the founding generation. One of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush, who was a little cranky most of the time, it seems, from his letters, was pretty insistent about this. And so he wrote in a couple of different fragments that what America needs is a school of forgetting. Right? Think about that. A school of forgetting, to just wipe it away. Jefferson needed a couple lessons in that school of forgetting, and you saw him working his own way through with the eraser. And so the idea of forgetting, of liberating people from the bonds of the past was very powerful. But let's remember another side to the generation, to the years following the Revolution, which became years of turmoil. So you have Shays' Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion. People freed from these bounds sort of don't have a lot of guardrails. So the other theme that began to emerge in the Republican generation was one of order. And this juxtaposition of liberty and order, I'm going to argue to you tonight, has been the framing dilemma of American citizenship and American civics education from the very beginning. So our friend Rush, who called for schools of forgetting, also said that we should create schools that would turn students into Republican machines, that would go in a stepwise fashion to support the idea of the American Republic. Noah Webster, who's an occasional dinner guest at Mount Vernon, often expressed a similar view, that what we needed to do was to establish a general system of education in order to form and support a federal government. So this idea, not only that education would promote liberty, but that it would support the state and the government, became a part of the conversation very soon after the Revolution. The idea of a national school system, much like the idea of a national university, didn't materialize for Webster or for Rush. But in the private marketplace, a nationalized curriculum quickly emerged, in which Webster and Parson Weems and others built a publishing industry for these emerging local schools, like the Academy, that in their common treatment of things like the American Revolution, the Constitution, creating short biographies of the great revolutionary leaders. I think every other one was Washington, and appropriately so. They created the Common Core, if you will, of the Republican school system that began to build in young people this sense that America, A, was different, B, was worth supporting, and C, needed their moral, physical, and intellectual help and support. These books celebrated sobriety, industry, restraint, and Washington's favorite, disinterested leadership. In addition to creating what we would today call the content of civic education, the founders and their supporters expressed an idea that was to have great, even transformative significance. And that's this notion that the state had an independent interest in the education of its citizens for citizenship. In fact, I'd argue that the idea of universal schooling at public expense originated with the needs noted by Washington and his fellow founders to create a new kind of Republican citizenry. And this has played itself out ever since, from the passage of the Northwest Ordinance, which early on in the history of the Republic set aside land in every surveyed county for the support of grammar schools, to last night's speech, in which the president called for even broader support for publicly funded education. So let's jump fourscore and a few years to the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction. And I want to do that, and I want to carry through this theme of the state having an independent interest in promoting public education on behalf of citizenship education. Historians have long noted the importance of the war to the expanding role of the state in civil life. But nowhere was this clearer than in education, where the nation's interest, the state's interest in creating citizens was put to the test in no uncertain terms with emancipation and the granting of the vote to freed slaves. For the slaves themselves, education had always been the sine qua non of freedom. Learning was the key that unlocked the intellectual bonds that held them, and it opened a world of agency and opportunity every bit as meaningful as physical liberty. As one ex-slave put it years later, "There's one sin that slavery committed against me, which I will never forgive. It robbed me of my education." And it did so systematically, not just through the deprivations of plantation society, but in the creation of slave codes across the South that also associated education and freedom and liberty, but thought it was a really bad idea. And so laws were passed in most of the southern states that made it a crime to teach slaves how to read and write, made it a crime for slaves to own books. And so entering the Civil War and entering Reconstruction, for slaves and white Southerners alike, the united notion of liberty and education was critical to understanding what happened next. Even before Appomattox, emancipated slaves had set up, against these rules, their own rudimentary schools. And missionary societies sent teachers to liberated areas of the South to spread both literacy and the gospel during the Civil War and early Reconstruction. In 1864, the Army created a division to supervise education in the occupied territories of the Confederacy. Let's pause. We have our national school system. It's run by the Army this time, and it's in the occupied areas of the South. This was superseded in 1865 by the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, which then took control of the education of all the 4 million newly freed African Americans in the former Confederacy. The core curriculum of the Freedmen's Bureau schools was the Freedmen's Book, a comprehensive set of materials that, from their math problems to their lessons in history, captured and reproduced the Republican virtues that Washington would well have recognized in a way that would have been familiar to him and to the founders. The Freedmen's Book was even heavier-handed than Webster, though, in laying down the rules of individual conduct. They assumed that slave behavior had been governed by external force, not by internal moral codes, showing how little they knew of the actual lives of slaves. And so the educators in the Freedmen's Book needed to insert a moral spine in their pupils and to do it right quick. So ditties like, "The web is a net. If a fly gets in it, he cannot get out. Sin is a web. The bad boy is in it. No one but God can help him now," were common in the Freedmen's book to carry these messages forward. Order was clearly the message of the day. The Freedman speller aimed to, quote, "show words in connection with important practical subjects, especially occupations, domestic life, civil institutions, morals, education, and natural science," end quote. The choice of these was significant, reflecting both the general character-building format of most 19th century educators and the specific civilizing thrust of most white freedmen's educators. Equally important to the development of virtue in the transformation of the post-plantation South was the importance of individual labor. As we've seen, reconciling the former slaves to a world of work in which they became wage or contract laborers was an important task for the Freedmen's Bureau. Texts reflected a more general approach, sanctifying labor as both an individual and a social act. Labor, concluded the Freedmen's Spelling Book, is a universal duty and beneficial to all. To read the homilies and lessons from the Freedmen's texts, one might think that they were aimed at a people who had never labored, rather than at a people whose existence had been defined by toil. Yet the relentless emphasis on the virtues of labor and the explicit descriptions of the kinds of labor appropriate for freedmen bespeak both a particular concern among whites for channeling black labor and the more enduring and general Calvinist themes that linked labor and salvation. What was clear was the fact that the Freedmen's book, in all of its permutations, did not aim at the kind of equal citizenship that might have dominated Washington's social view, nor equal participation in civic life, but instead to prepare former slaves for the roles that they would play in a society highly structured by class, history, and importantly, by race and ethnicity. The citizenship offered by the Freedmen's Bureau was a structured, ordered citizenship that bore only passing resemblance to the intellectual liberty of Enlightenment America. It was an important turn in the history of the idea of citizenship and of the mechanics of civic education. Our next to last stop on the tour is the Progressive Era, which we can define for our purposes as roughly 1890 to 1914. This was the period of great immigration and again, social turmoil in American society. American cities were flooded with 8 million new souls in just the 1890s. For social reformers, the scenes of urban squalor, unregulated child labor, and the growing income disparities and centralization of corporate power described a crisis in civic life unparalleled in their experience. What others saw, though, was a period of unrest and rising dissent. Labor organizing, the growing radicalism of the working class fueled by new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, and the ethnic fracturing of decades-long power structures in the major cities all represented a disturbance in the civic force that dismayed established elites. For our story about citizenship and education, what makes the Progressive Era so fascinating is that both sides turned to public education as the tool by which to wrench American civil society out of its tailspin. Thus, progressive education is a paradox. On the one hand, it was the heyday of John Dewey, calling for education in Jeffersonian, almost Rousseauian tones as the key to unlock the vast potential in each and every American, liberating individuals from the structures of race and class and creating a society that he called and hoped would be worthy, harmonious, and whole. On the other hand, the progressive period saw the rise of the educational manifestation of industrial America, in which order was the primary goal. In the words of Elwood P. Cubberley, quote, "Our schools are factories in which the raw materials are to be shaped and fashioned into products to meet the various needs of life. It is the business of the school to build its pupils to the specifications laid down." In the end, the specifications laid down were both economic and civic. They placed a premium on the virtues of discipline, obedience, and order, that were expressed not just in civics lessons, but in the very organization of the school and its culture, which had moved toward a system of rules, bells, and impersonal assembly line routine. At one point in the late 1890s, John Dewey went shopping for school desks at the University of Chicago Lab School, and he described what he wanted to a school desk vendor, and the vendor said, "Mr. Dewey, you're looking for desks at which students learn. We only sell desks at which students are taught." With immigrants pouring into schools along the eastern seaboard, Americanization became the order of the day. As historian David Tyack remarked, homogenizing American beliefs and values reached a fever pitch. Schools in all the nation's major immigration centers turned their attention to both preparation for industrial economic life, which included literacy in English, numeracy, discipline, attention to clock time, and to cultural homogenization. As one reformer put it, they, the immigrants, must realize that in forsaking the land of their birth, they are also forsaking the customs and traditions of that land. Schools that had been controlled locally and that had made accommodations to particular ethnic majorities, bilingual schools in Milwaukee, for example, came in the rationalizing moment of the Progressive Era, centrally controlled along Cubberley's vision, and in short order became places where children were called on in large ways and small, formally and informally, to relinquish their heritage. Esther Oberheim became Esther O'Brien, and Giuseppe Vagnotti came to school the next year as Mike Jones. For many immigrant families, the sacrifice of home culture for their children was part of an implicit bargain that exchanged old world traditions for new world opportunities. It was a fair bargain. But for the vast majority, the exchange proved one-sided, as immigrant children, like ex-slaves and blacks throughout our history, were tracked into what we would call dead-end jobs. In other words, at the end of the Progressive Era, Cubberley had won, and we are his direct inheritors. From the beginning, there are two contending themes in the history of civic education. One traces clearly between Russia's Republican machines to Cubberley's factory. This theme is about deploying education as a means of putting limits or guardrails on what is meant by liberty and democracy, dividing it off, their proponents would say, from both monarchy and anarchy. The other traces in fits and starts from Washington and Jefferson through some of the radical abolitionists to John Dewey, the idea that an educated, independent citizenry is the best, perhaps the only protection for democracy against the incursion of both corrupt institutions and harebrained ideas. One theme, at its extreme, requires the sublimation of judgment to rules. The other, the subjection of rules to judgment. Today, I fear that we are too much fans of order and not enough of liberty. But that's my editorial comment. What worries me at an even deeper level, as Denver was saying earlier, is that we've forgotten this most basic connection between the idea of public education and our need to create citizens, and to create citizens who are active, who are powerful, and who are impassioned in the continuing project of creating an American democracy. Whatever your views about the relative importance of liberty and order, I'd argue that the active practice of democracy is not a natural act. That's what the founders knew, and that's what I fear we're forgetting. The idea of democracy needs to be debated, refreshed, and contended in each generation. Historically, public schools have not only been the place we've turned to transmit ideas of citizenship and civic life, they have been the object of struggle about these same ideas. Today, though, debates about public schools are almost never about the questions of what kinds of citizens are we creating. Instead, they're about individual economic value creation, or too often, about the exclusion of educational opportunities. How odd would our current debates about denying educational benefits to dreamers sound to both Cubberley and Dewey? We've lost focus at our peril on the importance of an education that reminds us of the inevitability of our common destiny, the importance of our civic life, and the necessity for each of us to think of the we in a democratic society, as well as the I. In the beginning, the idea of publicly supported education was all about making citizens. It still should be. For me, I'll follow President Washington, who said, "A primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. In a republic, what species of knowledge can be equally important? And what duty more pressing than communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of our country?" Thank you.
There are a lot of things that we can talk about. I don't know about you, but I began to write a few down. I'm going to start with one that's not as deep. We're going to go deeper pretty quickly. But I am curious about this. Both Jefferson and Washington wanted universities. They didn't want grammar. I mean, they didn't turn to grammar schools or what we might consider a high school academy, although Washington got there. But there was this focus on university. And I'm curious, here we are in a university, and I'm curious about why at that moment in education, when so many Americans had virtually no education, what was it about the university you think that was so important to these two remarkable people, and others, obviously?
Good question. And it's particularly a good question when we think about the present day. It's often said that our higher education system is the envy of the world, whereas maybe our secondary system, not so much. And based on the premise of your question, it sounds like that's kind of from the start, right? And we've been maybe putting too much emphasis on higher education. No, I think in the founding generation, the project of building the United States, the project of state building, I think a university system was seen as part of that. And I think that the founders didn't have a notion of a full public education system that the government would somehow run. I mean, I think the question would be, how would that be done? And I think it was just completely out of their mindset that that was even a possibility. And so when they looked at England, they're always comparing themselves to Britain, Oxford and Cambridge and the great universities in Scotland. They wanted something to compete with those, and not just regular, what we might call an undergraduate degree, but professional schools. They wanted medical schools. They wanted law schools. Again, so Americans wouldn't have to leave the United States to get that kind of education.
They didn't know about community colleges yet.
Stay on message. I like
oh,
that.
sorry.
I like to see that.
That's the short answer, right, Jeff? They would have started there. But we had to pick up the slack after a couple hundred years.
A couple hundred years.
Yeah. So I think two other points. I think Denver's exactly right. Two other points is that I think even though haphazard, the colonies going into the Revolution had one of the highest literacy rates in the world. And so it was, even though it was, didn't go very far down the social structure. So that's one. I'm not sure that was their first pressing problem. And I think that they were continually concerned about and very self-conscious of leadership and leadership succession. And so I think in a corporate sense, they were really worried about succession planning. And when you looked around the Continental Congress and you saw a bunch of people who were moving on in years, and where were their successors going to come from, and where would they be educated, and sending them to England or to France seemed like about the last thing you would want to do.
It's a striking thing, though. And it ties back to my second question, and that is, I love this image of the machinery of democracy and the citizen as a machine in the democracy. And I'd like to tie it back to something that you each of you talked about, and that is the challenge of making sure that we have active citizens. And I do have this moment. I'm not looking forward to being czar, but I do have this. Can you imagine what it was like in 1785 when suddenly you're an American citizen, having spent much of your life as the subject of George III? I mean, that really is not just a political revolution. It's some level. I think both of you, it's this movement from the passive subject to the active citizen. It's almost psychological in your belief. And I'm curious about, how do you think they did? How long do you think was it quick? Did people make the change? We've often talked about how the Civil War is a moment where the United States becomes the United States, and I'm not pushing that, but I'm not Nicolas Cage, but I think that we do want to talk about how do you do that? Because in some sense we come back to that other question, which is, how do we do this, right? How do we create active citizens at a time when many of us feel that citizens aren't as active as they have been in the past? Or is that just nostalgia and it's always a fight to do this? Shall we start, Denver?
Sure. Well, I think part of the answer was the war. I mean, we often overlook that the American Revolution was a war, right? And it was a long war. Until recently, it was our second longest war after Vietnam, until our wars of the 21st century. And so, I think in a lot of ways that was the crucible of citizenship on a couple of different levels. One was Washington's leadership and some other national leaders who really kind of filled that vacuum left by monarchy. There's a lot of iconography celebrating Washington, almost deifying Washington. It almost seems anti-Republican in spirit. And maybe with anybody else that didn't have the same integrity, it might have become destructive to the Republic. But with Washington, it was okay. So you had the leadership, but you also had literally the foot soldiers, incredible amounts of participation in creating the country, first in the protests against Britain, and then in the war. And so, I think from the start, war is not a good thing, but it was a situation in which there had been sacrifice. People had blood for the Republic. So I think that was important.
And I absolutely agree. And I think that the War of 1812 kind of had another,
Absolutely, yeah.
Here they come again, piece to it. And so we have to defend what we have, what we fought for. And then I think that the subsequent generation was remarkable for many things. It's through when the Common School movement began, but in addition to the Common School movement, a great sort of social, pretty progressive social movement to try to lift up those who were suffering, the poor, the first wave of immigrants. And so I think that there was a way in which the kind of citizenship that we're talking about became active in social civic life, and that created some glue that held the country together during those first decades of the 19th century.
It's a little weird. I feel like a tennis match.
I feel like I need to bring Ted to my survey class, and we can, you complete me, Ted.
So
we complete each other.
I'm coming to Mount Vernon.
My last question before I open it up, how does gender play into this? Because you mentioned Republican motherhood. You talked about the freedom of the male slaves and the votes that came to them at a time when women still couldn't vote. At some level, there's almost this contradiction. We want women to be more and more Republican teachers, but we don't trust them to be actually Republicans themselves. And how does that work out, if you will, in the ways, it's a long answer, I know, but one suggestion. Ted, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. So I think that both of us told a story that has the major arc to it. If this were the survey course, we would do that over the course of a whole term, and we would take pieces of it out, and we would talk about where there were, and still are, important exceptions, right? And so in the Washington painting, you also have the slave serving in the background, right? And that was an important part of his life and the life of Jefferson, and one of the continuing conundrums about the founders. So I think that there is a history of both tacit, as in unconscious exclusion, and conscious exclusion that runs through this theme of citizenship, which I think makes it so important to look at those nodes where those exclusions were made into inclusions, and how we dealt with them. So if you'd given me more time.
Don't be greedy. Denver?
Yeah, I think when you look at it, the really interesting thing is what good citizens women were before they were allowed to be citizens, before they were allowed to have full citizenship. In Republican motherhood, in the volunteer societies during the American Revolution. Ted alluded to the reform movements of 1820s, 30s, 40s. Those are largely populated by women, incredibly activist.
The abolitionists, all the folks who went south.
And then the women suffrage movement becomes really the longest, just about the longest social movement in American history, along with the extended civil rights movement. And so by the time women finally received the vote in 1920, I mean, they had proved more than worthy of their full citizenship.
Just as a reminder to anybody who doesn't know, there's one other example that one of them I thought was going to use, and that is the decision of a group of women to save Washington's house.
That Jefferson and Washington, both Virginians, and one of the first things that Virginia had done during the Revolution was establish a system, I believe it's in Jefferson's notes, a system of grammar school and higher education, which people would go on to in every district of the state. So they may have felt that that part of it was already taken care of and wanted to concentrate on the university. That's just a possibility. The other thing I wanted to suggest was one thing that creates an idea of citizenship is not only reaching out, but finding the limits. And I think it might have been a kind of a revelation to the emerging citizens when the West Indies and Canada turned out not to be interested.
Excellent points.
Yeah, really good points.
All right, question? Yes, sir.
First, my name is Jeff Baum. I'm with the Annenberg School. But first off, I want to thank you for those presentations. They were truly exceptional and very stimulating. And,
Thank you.
And I also have to say, I chair the state's community college system in California. And I want to thank the president for his leadership in shining a spotlight on community colleges. And
thanks for your
wanted to
leadership.
say that publicly.
Thanks for your leadership.
There's so many questions that your presentation raised. So I want to go to something that probably might be politically sensitive, but there's a movement in the nation to require that all high school graduates take the U.S. citizenship education test as a qualification for graduation. How do we feel? We certainly believe everybody should possess that knowledge as citizens. How do we believe about, do you have any thoughts about that movement to require that high school graduates take a citizenship, pass the same test that all citizens are asked to pass?
That's a great question. And when I was listening to Ted's talk, I actually thought about the same thing, about what happened with the Freedmen's Bureau and different points in American history, that it seems like the country has always forced newcomers to citizenship, whether immigrants or former slaves or whatever it might be, to almost become indoctrinated with certain things, certain foundational knowledge, and yet native-born citizens just kind of skate past those kind of requirements. And so I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that. I don't think it's a terrible idea. I mean, I think it's to have a balance. I mean, I think, like Ted said, this balance between liberty and order. That's pretty heavy on the order half of the ledger. But if that was included with other more creative exercises of citizenship, then maybe it would be okay. I have two children, one who's 8 and one who's 10. And one thing that I've thought a lot about is that the culture of kids programming and media and different things doesn't seem to be as interested in civics or the American past than maybe it was during the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe not the 80s. But, I'm thinking of the old Peanuts cartoons, the Disney specials, and they were terrible in a lot of ways. The Davy Crockett, stuff was racist, and there were problems with it. But it was set in the past in an interesting way that, to this day, grips my children. And so I just think our entire culture of citizenship could change. Yeah.
What do you think of the test?
So I think that we generally over-test in America. I don't believe in a national test. I think if states chose to do that, that would be a fine thing. Now let me say some other things.
That was the political
Is that on the
part.
record?
That was the political part.
So I'm not sure that that's the test I would want to give. I don't know how many of you have looked at it lately. I encourage you to do so. It's very desiccated, and I think it's It's kind of like the driver's test, except with longer words. And I'm getting myself in real trouble now. So I think figuring out some way to help students get engaged in our past in a critical way, not just a consume and put back out way, which gives me the opportunity to make the ad for Sandra Day O'Connor's work. She has, this is her passion for her next career, is to create avenues towards citizenship learning for all kids. And she has a terrific website in which kids take on different roles and learn what the different roles are, and they play these simulation games. And have your kids done it yet?
No, but it sounds good.
Your
Yeah.
8-year-old is at exactly the right moment for it. So it's truly captivating. So I think that there are ways that we ought to encourage some of the new technologies to be able to help us think about citizenship.
My understanding is that throughout the United States, we have, if not hundreds, certainly, or if not thousands, certainly many hundreds of individual school districts, and each of which has a fairly substantial bit of control over curriculum, certainly K-12. At the same time, we were mentioning how there was the equivalent of Common Core going back to early textbooks that were used, quote, nationally. And we today have a movement toward Common Core, which is sort of kind of, again, a national curriculum. How do we balance between the concept of a basic level of education nationally, for we're all Americans first and Californians seconds, et cetera, and with having thousands of individual school districts that may or may not teach various science issues and language issues? How does that balance work or not work today? And does a high school education be equal from a poor portion of Mississippi versus, say, here in Los Angeles?
That is a great question. That was the question I was going to ask, but decided to ask and give you guys a chance.
That's good. I think that's in
You want me to take a shot at that? So I think you've put your finger on one of the basic problems, which is over the course of 50 to 75 years, two things happened. One, states decided that they needed to have standards for high school graduates and standards at different grade levels. Very admirable, the standards movement. And then what happened is that states, as it turned out, ended up with very, very different standards. And so students who were successful in one state, if they moved to a different state, found themselves either wildly ahead or wildly behind. Not because of anything that they didn't do, but because the target they were shooting for was just calibrated in a very different way. And so what we're calling the Common Core today really started from governors and the National Governors Association recognizing that as a problem in our increasingly mobile society and deciding that they would get together and they would create a set of standards that would then be submitted to each state for approval or rejection. I happened to be the president of the State Board of Education in California when that proposition came to us. And so we looked hard to see, first of all, if the standards were as strong or better than the ones we had, and if they still provided, and this is an important part, if they still provided the opportunity for the state and for local districts to create curriculum that met the standards, but was also consistent with the values of the state and the particular interests of the state and communities. And so when we think about the Common Core, don't think about textbook pages, think about the target. Think about fourth grade students need to be able to factor polynomials. That's it, that's the standard. And then teachers, districts have the important task of figuring out what are the right tasks to be able to do that. We'll see how it works. I have great optimism that, that this will both create a common set of standards and a higher set of standards. And finally, I think, any of you public school teachers in the room? Awesome. The hope, and again, in California, our hope when we were approving these in California is that because there were also fewer of them, it would be possible for teachers to bring more creativity back into the construction of class materials, class projects, and so on. I think that if done right, to bring it back to our discussion tonight, it creates the opportunity to use citizenship and to use projects around building American democracy as a part of the social studies curriculum, the history curriculum, the science curriculum, and that is the hope.
But are we getting it?
It
I
will-
mean, not the first part, I understand, beautifully stated, articulate, but going back to your, to me, the order has pushed us towards more and more economic success rather than a broad sense of what it means to be a student, if you will. And that concerns me as an historian.
Yeah, it concerns me as well, and I think that in my previous job, we worked with a lot of teachers who were building curriculum around Common Core. And so they found that they, by working together, were able to create lessons that were much more engaging, that had students thinking, being creative, problem solving in groups, rather than sitting, taking in material and regurgitating it. I think if you think back to the Cubberley piece, Cubberley was all about in, out, and be quiet and don't rustle when you're in your desk chair. And what we were seeing is we were seeing teachers rejecting that. And I think the common discussion is about teachers rejecting that and really wanting to be able to create more opportunities for students to be active, engaged learners. Substitute the last word, active, engaged citizens, is not that far a leap. Whether all teachers will do that, don't know. I think that that's where we have to really raise the bar in our conversation with school leaders.
My understanding of the Common Core is that it's focused on mathematics and sort of English language skills, and ironically, given the talk, not focused on civics, citizenship, things that we're here to hear about tonight and that we would like our children to know about. Can you comment on how we ended up with kind of an English math Common Core and not a Common Core that Washington would have related to?
Sure. It's English and math were the first two, but not the last two. So there's work underway now on both science standards and history standards, and so they'll be coming along. I think the choice of English and math is an artifact of the No Child Left Behind law that measured kids and schools on the basis of English and math achievement. And so to build out a different set of standards around the ones that were already being focused on seemed to the governors like the right place to start, but importantly, not the right place to stop.
So first of all, I'd like to echo, I'm Morley Winograd from Annenberg. I'd like to echo my colleague Jeff Baum's comments about the quality and excellence of the two presentations. Really, really terrific. I want to return to the theme of liberty and order. I have a question at the end of this statement, but I want to put in a little bit of context. The Republican generation that you referred to is in the theory of generational cycles, Strauss and Howe's theory of generations, considered a civic archetype. And it has been left to the civic generations of America to figure out the challenge of how you have both liberty and order in a democratic society. The Republicans did a beautiful job of it. We didn't really have that help in the time of the Civil War. The GI generation, which was a later version of a civic generation, did a terrific job of it in the 1930s and 40s. And today, the civic generation that's alive and very much with us is the millennial generation. And some of you know I've written a couple of books about them. And they approach the same challenge because they see the decline of our civic institutions over this inability to settle the matter of liberty and order for an information age. And while some people criticize their theoretical lack of civic engagement, it's actually quite high compared to their immediate predecessor generations, particularly Generation X, both in voting and in other ways. However, they don't usually buy into the mechanistic notion of balance, of a scale in which you put more weight on one or the other. They don't do it in issues around workplace culture, where they're looking for a blend rather than a balance of work and personal life. And I think they're going to take the same approach to this issue of liberty and order when they bring us the newest civic ethos resolution of that dilemma, that classical American dilemma, actually. So I'm wondering if you have thought about liberty and order as a DNA intertwined structure as opposed to a balance, which might strike millennials as a more profitable avenue of inquiry for solutions.
Let me add just that. Do you think that's true of that first generation? That it was entwined rather than...
I didn't say it was always. I'm saying...
No. I got you, Morley. But for the revolutionary generations, do you think it was entwined?
Yeah, I do.
Or was it a balance?
Yeah, I do. And I think, I talked about citizenship in an idealistic kind of way in terms of a lot of the privileges of it and the rights. But the founding generation always thought of responsibilities as well, and that's a key part of it. And that, that's part of the serving the public above your self-interest. All, I think, early American historians agree that at some point America took a turn from being this idealistic Republican society to a more individualistic society. But I think these things can be fused, and I think we see that in the service of young people in the armed forces in our most current wars. I completed an enlistment in the Army Reserves. I went to basic training with a bunch of 17-year-olds when I was in my 30s. And they wanted me to lecture to, I was a professor already, they wanted me to lecture to them when lights went out in the barracks. They wanted to learn. And I see that same eagerness with college students. And maybe that's a self-selective group, especially ones that want to be in Washington, D.C. But I love the way that you phrased that about merging those two things.
Maybe 2.5 quick responses. So I agree. I think that the intertwining is a great way to think about it for this generation. And I would think about sort of two places where I think we're seeing that happen most. And one is in the rapid proliferation of social entrepreneurship among the millennial generation, where on the one hand you think of entrepreneurship as the most genuine form of intellectual and civic entropy. But on the other hand, when you look at the purposes of the entrepreneurship, it is sort of dead on the hardest problems that we have to solve. And so I think that that's one of the places where, at least for me, it really your notion of intertwining happens. I think the other is, and completely anti-mechanistic, is a sense that I'm feeling with the millennials and just the tail end of the previous generation, you can tell me if I'm making it up, that as a society we seem to be rejecting mechanistic notions of almost everything and replacing them with the idea of networks that form and unform around problems or issues, and sometimes those are social movement kinds of networks, sometimes those are utilitarian networks to get something done as a social project. But this idea that the network will have, and kind of to your point about the West Indies and Canada, that networks have natural boundaries. We don't have to create them. They're going to exist as the network sort of peters out over time. And so you need less of the guardrails that I mentioned to keep those in place. So those are the two ways that I would think about it. The half, which your reserve training reminded me of, is that one of the other things that I didn't talk about that I think is coming back, and Denver talked about it in connection with the war, but coming back to another conversation that we're having about citizenship is the way that the draft and the common experience of military service was another way, especially in the 20th century. The social boundaries were crossed and galvanized the community. Mm-hmm. And I do hear more and more talk about national service as an important way for us to think about new kinds of experiments in citizenship.
Yoko Igawa, I'm a Master of Public Administration alumna. I have two questions, but maybe you could pick one to make it quicker. One is that, what do you think are the effects of order when, especially due to continuous improvement of education after it's debated and recreated continuously, that the norm becomes a very highly educated or probably maybe college-educated public where the working class or everybody is graduating with a college degree. I remember the summer between my undergraduate and master's degree, graduate programs. A lot of my friends could only get jobs at, we may have been in a recession, but a lot of my college-educated peers were only getting jobs at Starbucks or at the mall, and that was the norm. And my other question is, perhaps, what do you think the backlash is of having such a robust education system that we are afforded the liberties to pursue professional degrees at a higher rate, but understand that we have to wait so long. We have to typically wait until you're in the late 20s or early 30s, sometimes even later, to finally practice the professional skills that we are trained in. What do you think are those backlashes after having such a great education system?
Impressive questions. Just to take the second one, that'll be my choice. It's remarkable to look at the figures in the 18th century, early 19th century, and how much they accomplish at such a young age. And of course, the lifespan was shorter, so they had to get on it. But I think this is an unfortunate thing and a consequence, especially of our most recent recession, this idea of delayed entry into adulthood and professions and et cetera. And hopefully that's not something that will stay permanent. Because I think you're right. At a certain point, it leads to the questioning of education, of why go to school? Why do these different things if it's just going to lead to permanent residence with parents or something like that? So it's a good question.
I too will choose number two. Echoing Denver, it's fascinating the artifacts that we continue to live by as we organize higher education in not only this country but across the world. And I do think that it's changing. And I don't want to pretend to be a techno-utopian about this, but I do think that we now have opportunities, and the Price School is a leader in this. We have opportunities to deliver and get high-quality education that's not connected to time and place. And if we can think about especially the time part and begin to move some portions of everybody's education to be more about competencies and mastery, rather than quarters and semesters and course hours, I think we will begin to change that a lot. And a lot of it is truly historical artifacts. So the president before Charles Eliot at Harvard, Harvard was a 3-year institution, and when the new president came in, Cambridge had just moved from 3 to 4, and so to be legitimate, Harvard moved from 3 to 4. If Harvard had rejected that one urge to isomorphism, we may have 3-year undergraduate degrees in this country from the beginning.
Couple things. I don't know if it's
Although
really
we're
a
gonna be
question
quick.
or an observation. Okay. We've mentioned several generations. Washington's generation, Depression, World War II generation, and now the latest one. I don't know if you can really teach citizenship. I was lucky enough that my family was very political, so we discussed it. However, those generations you've mentioned, 2 of them, had no choice. They had great sacrifice. That sacrifice, they paid a great price for, whether it's people who died in their family, the sufferings, etc. Okay, that generation, because of that sacrifice, they paid that price. They hungered for that. They needed it. They wanted to protect it. World War II was the same way. They paid a price. The generations now, and I'm not saying that there aren't sacrifices, I don't think they've really experienced the suffering or some of the things that that those generations did. What are your thoughts on that? Is it is out of necessity that citizenship is learned because you paid a price
It's a
for
really
it?
good question. How do you teach, if you will, civics or citizenship in abeyance of a huge crisis in the society?
Yes. No, I think you're right on. I think it's a great question. I think the percentage of people that have participated in our most current wars is something like 0.45% or something. And it is hard, I think, when the broader society doesn't feel all the sacrifice. So, I don't know. It's a problem.
Yeah, so if the essence of citizenship is about shared commitment, creating or needing the occasions for that shared commitment are important. And I think in the absence of externally constructed ones, the ones that you mentioned, I think it's important for us as educators and as leaders in a variety of walks of life to think about how to create that moral equivalency, which is, I think, part of the reason that there is currency for a national service conversation again. I mean, it's not the sacrifice of the battlefield, but it is taking you off your normal track. It's asking you to commit with your fellow Americans who you might not have been with before to a set of projects, a set of commitments that are bigger than you. And so I think that our challenge is, as David said, to look for those opportunities and try to create them where we can.
You talked about active citizens, and I'm interested in the activities that were expected of citizens early on. And I kind of asked that in terms of the contemporary critique of citizen engagement, which says in part, on the one hand, that government doesn't provide opportunities for in-depth participation, and on the other hand, citizens are doing all kinds of other things and don't want to participate, or at least don't participate.
Good question to both of you. I think it is actually an excellent question. What is an active citizen in 1790? What does it mean?
Yeah, excellent question. It was gendered, heavily male, right? Even the word, virtue always went along with citizen and with Republican, and virtue was at that time much more of a male word. It kind of transformed in the 19th century to 20th century to more female, virtuous, kind of meaning chastity. But to be virtuous in the 18th century was to belong to the militia, or in the Revolution to join the Continental Army. So it was so connected to military service. And again, it comes back to the last question: how do we create parallel tracks that aren't so militaristic that provide opportunities for citizenship? I think it's a great question. And just because this might be the last time I speak, I want to thank you all for all the questions. The level of discussion here has just been terrific. I really enjoyed it.
Ted?
So I think that even highly gendered, this, for example, the idea of Republican motherhood, I think from the founding generation there was an idea that no matter where you were in society, you could do things that would advance the building of America, and that would be a kind of civic virtue. And I think, and then you could take that up through the social movements of the reform movements of the 1820s and 1830s. You could take it into the Civil War and beyond. I think that it goes back to the question of the citizenship test. I think, in large part, we've narrowed and dried up what we mean or what comes to mind when we talk about citizenship. And we think about voting, and we think about participating and going to the school board debates, and we think about watching the State of the Union address. And because this will be the last time I get to say goodbye to you, thank you for having us. The questions have been great, and it's just a privilege to think about this with you. I think that's why the president said at the end of his speech last night that we are all about building America. And I think what he was trying to say, and know what he was trying to say in that, was trying to go back to that earlier view that said it doesn't matter where you are, and it doesn't matter if you're sitting in the chamber or if you're working on a social entrepreneurship project in Watts. What you're doing to build America is a part of what we ask of our citizens. And that's the kind of citizenship that I would hope that we would all embrace.
So I have two things. One, please thank the panelists, and then I'm bringing up my dean to say thank you.
I was incredibly impressed by the insights that we gained into the Revolutionary Warrior and Washington and his attitudes and ideas about education and citizenship, but also how that is so contemporary and how it relates to where we are today and the questions we have today. And the back and forth, I thought, was quite remarkable. And your questions were fantastic. So please join me in thanking Denver and Ted and David for an outstanding.
Thank you.